I like to ride the omnibus Nova.
Sounds like Scooby-Doo.
Welcome to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast. For anyone who thinks that the new medical study that they just heard about in the news is as difficult to comprehend as learning to drive a stick shift, I just
Did you just learn?
No, I learned a long time ago.
Oh.
But I found it so difficult when I learned. Challenge. You guys know? You guys found it easy?
Relatively, but you know, I burned out a clutch.
Yeah,
or two.
that's my point. Oof. Yeah. I'm Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health, here with Don Thea and Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health.
Hello.
Hey, Matt.
And we are here, as always, in the Boston University Godley studio. Before we get started, we did want to take a second to remind you about the Population Health Exchange, which is Boston University School of Public Health's resource hub for lifelong learning. Find out more at www.pophealthex.org, where you'll find this podcast, as well as many other population health learning programs and tools. And I also wanted to make a special plug. The Population Health Exchange is having its Summer Institute again this year. It's the week of June 11th and June 18th here at the Boston University School of Public Health, where you can come and take courses in things like systematic reviews and meta-analysis or SAS course. It's a good time and much learning is had. So go ahead to the Population Health EX website and you can find out more information and register. And a reminder, go ahead and give us a rating on iTunes. Give us a review, especially if you like the podcast. It'll help others find us. So just a little bit of housekeeping. I did want to point out that I've gone back into the archives and looked at our download statistics, and I would like to say, what do you think was I would like to ask you, what is our highest, most downloaded episode, except for the first one, which of course gets the most downloads because it's where often people will start. By the way, don't start with the first one.
I bet it was the one where it was really funny.
Yeah, so none of them.
Have we recorded that one yet?
Not yet. Guess.
It was the calcium one, wasn't it?
It was not the calcium one.
Was it the...
Oh, it was the diarrhea one.
Was it... No, it can't be that one. Was it the...
Wait, define... What do you mean the diarrhea one?
The one where the capsules...
The poop pill.
The poop pill.
No way.
Yes.
No.
And I would like to say that was my idea, and you guys poo-pooed it for a bit.
Stop.
And then I finally convinced you to do it. It's our most downloaded episode.
Wow.
Just want to point that out. Okay, so on to the show.
Makes me worry about our listeners.
Makes me worry about us. So today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to do a follow-up podcast to episode 19, which I highly recommend you go back and listen to, which was episode 19. We looked at a systematic review of the literature on antidepressants. And as we were going through that, Chris alerted us to a study that was a reanalysis of a drug trial which was looking at the benefits of two different antidepressants in adolescents. And it's got a really sort of fascinating story that goes along with it. So it's not a new study, but we thought it was worth getting into. In the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we are going to talk about the Registered Reports Revolution. Registered Reports Revolution,
That's right.
which is going on in the psychology world or sociology. I'm not sure exactly where it's going on right now and what we can learn from it in our world. And then in our third segment, which is our amazing, our amusing, we will get into some things that gave us the giggles or just blew our minds. So let's get into it. Segment one. So as I say, we're going to go back a bit. And this will be sort of like our podcast that we did on MMR and autism and the fraud that was perpetrated, research fraud that went on around MMR and autism, which also I highly recommend you go back. That was also one of our highest downloaded episodes. And so what we're going to look at today is an article that did a reanalysis of data from a trial that compared two antidepressant drugs, paroxetine and imipramine. Did I say that right, Chris?
Sure did.
Compared those to placebo for treatment of major depression in adolescents. The new study was published in the British Medical Journal. We say BMJ a lot, but people probably don't always know that that's the British Medical Journal. So this had first author Joanna Lenouri of the School of Medical Sciences, Bangor University in Wales.
Yeah, Bangor. Yeah.
Bangor, like in Maine?
Yeah.
And the title is Restoring Study 329, Efficacy and Harms of Paroxetine and Imipramine in Treatment of Major Depression in Adolescents. Now, the study was published in 2015, but this study reanalyzes data from a study published in 2001 that was funded by SmithKline Beecham. The original study was published in the Journal of American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry with Martin Keller as the first author from the Department of Psychiatry at Brown University. Now, I've got no headlines on either one of these two studies because they're from so long ago. But Don, can you start off by sort of talking us through the original study and then the reanalysis and why it was done?
Yeah. So essentially, we're gonna talk about two analyses of the same data set. So what I want to do is I want to sort of walk you through the original paper, as Matt mentioned, which was published in 2001 by Keller et al. And essentially what they were trying to do is do this head-to-head comparison against placebo of two antidepressants, one of which was a tricyclic and the other one was at the time, a relatively new one called paroxetine. And there had been a remarkably few number of randomized controlled trials on these at the time, and none in adolescents. So the authors felt that there was a real unmet need in terms of trying to look at both the efficacy and the safety of paroxetine and imipramine compared to placebo in adolescents. So this was done in 10 psychiatric centers, academic centers. I think it was just limited to the United States. It may have been Europe.
I believe so.
Yeah.
No, I think it was in the U.S.
Right. So it was double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to assess efficacy and safety with parallel design, meaning that the paroxetine was compared with placebo, as was imipramine compared with placebo. And they enrolled males and females, 12 to 18 years old, adolescents, who had a current episode of a major depression that had lasted at least 8 weeks at the time of enrollment. And the way they measured this is something called a Hamilton score, which is really a score of 17 items. And the higher the score, the more depressed you are. So these children had to have 12 out of 17 items positive on that score. They were excluded if they had other serious illnesses, I think including a suicide attempt in the recent past. And the primary outcome was an improvement in this score such that the number went from 12 to less than 8, which is an improvement in your depression, or a 50% reduction at 8 weeks over what it was at baseline. There are a bunch of secondary outcomes in terms of self-perception and other kinds of depression scales, sort of more limited. There was a 7 to 14-day screening phase to ensure that the depression was persistent and severe, and the allocation was 1-1-1 across the three groups. The adolescents were seen weekly, all three groups, with supportive measures. It's something that we talked about in the last podcast in terms of there are other aspects to the management of depression that may not have nothing to do with the drug itself. They had 425 screened and then 275 randomly assigned to the experimental groups, which is interesting because originally, and we'll get into this, originally in the protocol they said they're going to assign 300, but halfway through they determined that the variance was less so that they could dial back that final number. So it's 300, instead of 300 across all groups, it was 275. The efficacy results were calculated on all if the subject had at least one visit after the baseline, and there were two ways that they did the statistics, where they counted the outcomes. One was the last observation carried forward. We talked about that before, so that if somebody had 2 out of the 8 visits, they would take what their score was on that second visit and carry it forward. And then the other way they did the analysis is they looked at only adolescents who had completed all 8 weeks of visits. And I think that ended up being about 69% of all of the adolescents that were enrolled. There was some non-compliers, and the distribution of non-compliance in terms of dropouts was 24% in placebo, 28% in paroxetine, 40% in imipramine, because imipramine is a medication that we know has cardiac side effects, so it has known to have more side effects. And essentially, with both the last observation carried forward analysis and the completer analysis, their conclusion was that paroxetine was more efficacious, 63% of the adolescents in that arm achieved the outcome as compared with 50% in the imipramine group and 46% in the placebo group.
And those are statistically significant differences?
The paroxetine was
Yeah.
at the 0.02 level.
Yep.
And they also
0.05.
For these secondary endpoints.
I thought it was 0.02, but
The p-value was 0.02,
yeah,
you're saying?
yeah, p-value is 0.02.
Yep.
And they also looked at adverse events, which in this setting occur relatively rarely, and they reported any adverse event, and they categorized them, and they found that there was a slight increase in adverse events in the paroxetine group, and as compared to the imipramine group and the placebo group. So their interpretation was efficacious and not that harmful. So then what the Nuri et al. Went back and actually got the original data from the pharmaceutical company, because there had been a lawsuit and they were able to get access to the data, which is not the kind of thing that I think pharmaceutical companies are necessarily going to give up voluntarily. But
They tend to be reluctant.
They tend to be reluctant. The data that they got was enormous. I mean, the amount of information that goes into studies like this is huge. And Chris, you've had personal experience with this, and it's a truckload of data that goes down to the FDA before the results of this study like this can be included in the indication profile for a particular medication.
So who got the data?
So the second set of reviewers got the data. Researchers got the original data from the pharmaceutical company, and they went through it very, very carefully. And what they wanted to do was essentially they wanted to do a reanalysis of these data using the original criteria that had been outlined in the protocol. And one of the things that they note was that the outcomes that were reported on were not outcomes that were part of the original protocol. So they kind of added on the outcomes after the fact. It was before the data were unblinded, but it was still after the fact.
So at this point, you're not saying at this point that they changed the data or anything. You're saying they simply decided to present outcomes that were not originally specified in the protocol.
Correct.
And I can't remember, when you say they weren't specified, were they not in the protocol at all, or they just were not specified as?
They were not in the protocol at all.
At all.
And the protocol had been amended multiple times, so they had many opportunities to do this. But that none of these endpoints actually ended up in the protocol itself.
Okay. So the idea was they cherry picked, you could say.
Yes.
The outcomes that were beneficial to them to present.
And in terms of the original study, the outcomes that supported the efficacy claim and the harm claim were the ones that were not originally specified.
The post hoc.
Post hoc.
Yeah.
So anyway, so they collected the data. They adhered to the original data analysis plan, and then they went back into the case report forms and they looked at the original data in terms of harm. And I'll come to that in a second. What they found was that the statistical approach that the original authors used was not actually necessarily fair. The last observation carried forward was sort of state of the art at the time in 2001. They used two different techniques, which are more relevant for this point in time. It was multiple imputation and mixed models, which are now considered to be superior approaches, right?
Yeah, and I do think it's worth pointing out those were the last observation carried forward has been shown to be a biased approach, but
Duh.
But it was the accepted standard of care at the time that they did this. So there was nothing. I don't think there was anything funny going on.
Then the other thing that the second set of authors noted that they thought was a deviation was from the protocol was that, and Matt, you'll have to sort of walk us through this a little bit more detail, that a pairwise analysis of two of the three groups was done when the omnibus ANOVA showed no significance.
Yeah.
And maybe what I'll do is I'll turn it over to you so you can flesh that out a little bit.
I like to ride the omnibus ANOVA.
Sounds like Scooby-Doo.
Go ahead. Keep going.
All right. So in any event, when they used the original protocol and they used the different statistical methods, they basically came up with a null finding that the paroxetine was not any more efficacious, which was a bit concerning. But in my opinion, even more concerning was that when they went back to the case report forms, they identified a whole bunch of adverse events that had not previously been reported. There were 265 adverse events reported in the paper. The reanalysis found 481 adverse events.
And heavily skewed towards the Prozac arm.
And heavily skewed towards the Prozac.
We haven't said Prozac is which drug is
Fluoxetine, sorry.
Right. So the underestimates of adverse
that
events
wasn't one of the
were
drugs.
Paroxetine?
Paroxetine was
Is it paroxetine or fluoxetine?
not
no,
fluoxetine.
it's paroxetine.
Yeah.
So Paxil.
Paxil. Thank you.
So the underestimates of the adverse events were 14% in the paroxetine group, 7% in the imipramine group, and 13% in the placebo group. So they didn't report an overabundance of adverse events in the paroxetine group.
Can we just clarify for people? So paroxetine is Paxil. Imipramine is
Imipramine. I think we just call it. It's probably called something.
okay.
I have no idea.
But the one we're most concerned about here, which because it was reported to have shown a benefit, is Paxil, which is say it.
Right, paroxetine, which is one of these SSRI Prozac-like drugs.
Yep.
So, and then the other thing was that they also found that there were 11 serious adverse events in the paroxetine group versus 2 in the placebo. So the bottom line of the reanalysis is, in fact, that the original study found efficacy and no harm. The reanalysis found no efficacy and more harm.
Considerable harm.
Considerable harm.
Yeah. Chris, so obviously this is a really impressive piece of work. I mean, this is not, when you look at the MMR case that we looked at in one of the earlier episodes, the number of cases that the reporter had to track down to solve, to identify that these cases were misreported was what like 30, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, here, okay, they didn't have to track people down, but the amount of data that went into this
77,000 pages.
77,000 pages, and it wasn't just 77,000 pages, but they couldn't actually access all the data. Some of it had to be accessed through an agreement and a negotiation with the drug company, which allowed them to only view it via a remote desktop type scenario, so they couldn't actually go through it all.
They couldn't print it, in other words. They had to look at it on a screen. One at a time.
And so they made the decision that they couldn't actually look at all the data, so we don't actually know about all of it. This is an amazing piece of work. But Chris, what's your take on the overall story?
Well, I wanted to start by just quoting the Keller et al. Paper in their conclusion. The original paper from 2001. And this is the conclusion statement. It says, the findings of this study provide evidence of the efficacy and safety of the SSRI paroxetine in the treatment of adolescent depression. That is a pretty definitive, like Yahoo, we have...
assertive statement.
This is an assertive statement of safety and efficacy. And this is relevant because, for those who are not aware, treating depression in adolescents is notoriously difficult. It's one of the big gaps in psychiatry where traditional antidepressants have been very impotent. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for this new class of drugs, the Prozac-like drugs, the SSRIs, that maybe this would be the salvation for treating, it was sort of like the holy grail of treatment of adolescent depression. Now, that was in 2001. This paper was enormously influential in terms of changing the treatment paradigm to promote the use of this class of drugs. But now 16, 17 years later, what has emerged is that, first of all, the study has been largely discredited and enormous criticism have been leveled of it. The company itself was slapped with a $3 billion fine for off-label marketing of these drugs to adolescents without actually having an indication. So they jumped the gun on this. And then the more troubling thing is that there was a trickle of reports that adolescents who were started on SSRIs had an increased risk of suicide. And so when we go back and we look at the riot data, the part of the information, the reanalysis in the BMJ, this new the repeat the second analysis of the original data, when beyond saying the drugs were relatively impotent, they did not change depression outcomes. What they did do is to increase the risk of certain side effects, and the most worrisome, particularly in hindsight, are suicidal ideations. And so when we look at the original Keller paper,
2001,
comparing the three groups, Paxil, paroxetine, imipramine and placebo respectively. They were 5, 3, and 1 event in each of those arms respectively. So
they were roughly the same size groups.
and they were roughly the same size group. So 5, does kind of look like there's a trend towards, this is where a trend towards significance. But here they were happy to say there was no trend towards significance because the numbers were too low. And so they could sort of hide behind the lack of statistical significance as a shield, which, as you know, is a little bit saucy.
When he says you, he's talking to Don.
I'm talking to...
But
I'm looking fondly at Matt and thinking of Don.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. Please don't look.
But in the reanalysis, that 5 and 3 and 1 suicidal ideation events ballooned to 11, 4, and 2. Where there were 11 suicidal ideations or attempts in the Paxil group. Yep. And that was not in the manuscript, nor was it, in fact, in the clinical study report from SmithKline-Beecham. So there was an underreporting in both cases.
Yep.
But the Keller paper even shaves it finer, removing some of the suicidal events that were reported in the clinical study report. And so it really hid what we now look back and say with hindsight, that this is the most important liability of the SSRIs in adolescents is the risk of suicide. And the data were actually right there, but we're not,
So how did
it's a really shocking story.
How did they do this? How did they pull this off?
Who? The original?
The original authors, how did they pull off this sort of underreporting of these adverse events?
Well,
by underreporting?
The paper was ghostwritten by
Yes.
SmithKline-Beecham. So the authors, Keller and colleagues, had relatively little to do with the analysis. They certainly would not have had access to the data themselves.
And I couldn't access it, but there's a paper that talks about this, right? The ghostwriting aspect that's been found out that the first author didn't actually write the paper.
But what they did, from my understanding, one of the ways they pulled this off was by manipulating their assumptions. So what they said in the original paper was that we are going to report on adverse events that occur at greater than a 5% frequency. And they also had this very complex matrix of categorization. And you could easily justify in your mind that a particular adverse event could go in a cardiovascular category or a neurological category. And it seems to me that they kind of may have intentionally spread them out so that these adverse events wouldn't reach that 5% threshold and therefore didn't need to be included.
Yeah.
So, I think it was, I don't know whether it was fully intentional or whether it was only partially intentional, but...
My guess is that the authors were unwitting on this.
Right.
But that doesn't really get them off the hook because if you put your name on a paper, you're saying you're the guarantor of what the paper says. And you can't say, well, we didn't actually do the analysis and we didn't actually write the paper and we just took the kudos for having our names published.
Right. And
that's no defense.
And paper presentation now has become a lot more transparent in that way. Now you have to state what role you took in the generation of these data. It doesn't solve the problem.
It's
studies like this that I think provided the impetus to improve that transparency.
So can I jump in here? So I have to say this. So this is an amazing piece of work. This reanalysis. The fact they were given this data in the first place was phenomenal. I found this article a little bit hard to read, largely because it's expansive. I mean, it's much larger than a normal article, but also because I was quite distracted in that this sort of is. This is like a mystery novel, and so I found myself I kept in my mind, I kept sort of wandering off to, well, I wonder whatever happened to this first author guy, and I wonder, why was the paper not retracted, and was this paper cited in the meta-analysis that we reviewed? I think the answer is no, because that was restricted to adults. I went and looked; it's not in there. Who was the ghostwriter? I just there were so many avenues that I wanted to go down. I found it really difficult to focus on the real issues, which were twofold, as you say. One, deviations from their protocol, not doing exactly what they said they were going to do, which benefited them, and not counting, or depending on how you summarize it, they sort of manipulated the data on the adverse events to make it look better than it was. But I have to admit, I had some real problems with the way that the original study went, regardless of whether or not there was manipulation, even if you took this data at face value. And I say that because for many of the reasons that we talked about when we talked about the meta-analysis of the depression studies, which is this was a study of 90-ish patients per arm. This is a small study that you wouldn't want to bet the farm on, even if it were perfectly correct.
Particularly in terms of safety.
It was an 8-week study, so we're not talking about long-term follow-up, so long, and it had 31% dropout, as you pointed out. So we know we have a study with problems. There were also some baseline imbalances between arms, which you would expect in a study where only 90 patients were randomized per arm. So I'm a little shocked at the amount of weight that was put into this original study to begin with. Let's say it was totally non-fraudulent, that they had done everything right. This wouldn't be enough to convince me that this is great. Now, what I did was I took the two figures from the two articles. So this is the original and the new article. I know the listener can't see this, but I just sort of put them next to each other so that I could sort of see what's happening. And from left to right, what you have is depression dropping over time, but it's dropping in all three groups: placebo, imipramine, and
paroxetine. And the three lines look almost superimposed.
And they look almost the same in both the new analysis and the old analysis. Why? Because in terms of the main analysis, the problem wasn't manipulation of the data. It was manipulation of the statistics, as you said, Don. So what did they do? They essentially said in their protocol, we're going to do this kind of statistical test that looks for differences overall between three groups. If we find that, then we'll do comparisons of the individual.
The pairwise analysis.
Yeah. Group 1 to 2,
Group 1
to 3, 2 to 3.
Then we'll find out if one drug is better than placebo or not. And what the new analysis says is we didn't find any benefit overall. So in comparing all three, and so we should never have looked at the two on their own.
Pairwise analysis.
Okay, yeah. As you know, I hate this. This is foolishness to me.
Yeah.
Well, whether it's significant on this test versus that test or not, to me is totally irrelevant. Whether you had specified it in advance or not, to me is irrelevant. What matters is these two figures, the one from the old study and the new study, are identical and both show
no difference.
There's pretty much nothing going on. So the statistically significant benefit that they saw in the original study is a tiny benefit.
Yeah.
And that should have been the message to begin with,
right.
Especially when you know that tiny benefit is based off of a study that had 31% dropout, that had some baseline imbalances.
Where the blinding was apparently corrupted.
There were problems. And so the idea that you would ever have said that this is a study that was worthy of approving this for, I don't know that they did, but I'm just saying that you would say this is the information that tells us we should be treating adolescents with this drug. It's just suspect to me. Now, it's hard, right? Because if you have no treatment, then a small improvement is probably worth it. But so I don't mean to imply that this is easy.
Yeah. So, Chris, you've been involved in providing an application somewhat similar to what would have been provided the FDA for this study. Is Matt pointing out a too low threshold for acceptance of efficacy in a study like this as the main outcome that the FDA would use to generate an indication for this drug?
Yes, I think this, and in fact, it did not, right? So this is why they got that fine, that they were not able to demonstrate efficacy and safety to the satisfaction of the regulator, but that they went ahead and marketed it anyway, largely on the basis of Keller, because in fact, Keller was not the first study to look at the efficacy and safety of SSRI drugs in adolescents. It's just that the other studies had not found any benefit. And so this was the outlier. And that then subsequently drove the practice and led to this. I mean, if you look at the title here, the original paper, Efficacy of Paroxetine in the Treatment of Adolescent Major Depression in Randomized Controlled Trial, a more accurate title would be Lack of Efficacy of Paroxetine versus Placebo and Possible, Induction of Suicidal Ideation. I mean, that would have in fact described what they found.
Yeah. Okay.
Warning, black box warning, do not use.
So an amazing piece of work, really, really impressive. So let me end with one thing, which is that one of the criticisms here is that they didn't follow their protocol, right? They essentially what they did was they, in addition to the outcome that we just talked about where there really wasn't much going on, what they did was they took some other outcomes where they did see a benefit and they included those.
And then they tooted their horn hard about that.
Yeah. And so to me, the problem there is the tooting your horn hard about it. It's not that they did it. So this idea of, if your drug shows a benefit on one scale and not another, that's information. How much weight we put into it, sure, is determined by how many, are you just throwing everything at it? Like when we did the Prevagen study and they took all these different things and reported on the one where they found a benefit, fine.
It's like throwing a bowl of spaghetti at the wall.
But I also think, we don't want to, if they had specified in advance that these other measures were the ones they wanted to look at, then we would take it as valuable. I think there's too much weight put in this. And there's a statement in the paper, the reanalysis, that says, finally, although the investigators can explore the data however they want, additional outcome variables outside those in the protocol cannot be legitimately declared once the study is underway, except as exploratory variables, appropriate for discussion as material and further, or as material for further study, but not for the main analysis. I don't fall quite on that scale. I mean, I think you have to be upfront about it, and I think you have to be very careful about the way you talk about it. But I think if we find something that's interesting, we should be able to talk about it. And I think that gets us into our second segment,
Really
which
does.
is
It's a perfect
which is
segue.
what I wanted to transition into. So in the second segment, we want to talk about a movement that's been going on in the psych world, something that is called pre-registration. And I say something called because I don't know that this is something that the majority of people in our field, in epidemiology and in medical research, know widely about. But the idea came in response to the replicability crisis that's been going on in the psych world, where studies have been done that come out, they have this really sort of interesting or splashy finding, but then when people go to try and replicate these studies, and they're often small studies that are done, scientists can't replicate the finding. The most famous example of this is the power posing study that happened, that came out. It was a big deal. The idea that you can make yourself feel more powerful and in fact change your biochemistry by actually assuming certain powerful poses. It was published, it became a big deal, and then people tried to replicate this and they couldn't. And this began to highlight some various problems, one of which is the problem of p-hacking. The idea that you would just, change your model and add more things until you got the answer that you want. So let me ask you guys this question.
Or harking.
Harking is another good one. Hypothesizing after the results are known. I like that one, although I like the acronym. I'm not sure I
What
totally...
would the angels sing about?
That's a good question. So let me ask you guys this question. If you are studying some exposure in relation to some outcome...
They were not talking about questionable research practices. I'm sure of it.
I'm sure they were not. QRPs.
Questionable research practices.
That's another term I didn't know until I...
Quirps.
So you're studying some exposure in relation to some outcome. You've got reasonable power, so the study's well powered, it's big enough sample size. If there's no effect of your exposure on the outcome, which do you think is more likely? A p-value of 0.03 or a p-value of 0.85? There is truly no effect of your exposure on your outcome. Which of those two p-values is more likely?
0.03, I would guess, because of publication.
No. Okay, we're not having publication bias.
So just
you do your
statistically.
study. Yeah. Which one is more likely? No effect of the exposure on the outcome.
I don't know. I have no idea. You tell me.
I would assume you would have said the 0.85 because
it's easier.
there is no effect.
Or are they equivalent?
Or what equivalent?
0.03 and 0.85?
Those are p-values. So
P-values,
they are not equivalent. They're two different numbers.
But the distance from 0.05 is roughly the same.
No. One's 0.03, one is 0.85. They're nowhere vastly different.
We need to study harder for
hold
the next quiz.
I was told there would be no math.
I took a math class when I was a fellow.
Okay.
I think that's 3.5 versus 2. Yeah, I see what you mean.
They're very different. And the answer to the question is, if there's no effect of the exposure on the outcome, they're equally as likely.
Right.
Any p-value is it's essentially a random draw, and 5% of the time you get a p-value below 0.05,
Right.
and 95% of the time you get a p-value above 0.05, assuming no bias, perfect study, randomization, all that.
Does chewing gum increase the risk of meteor strikes?
Okay. Yes.
For example.
Exactly. Now, you're doing a study of an exposure which does have an effect on an outcome. Same scenario, you got plenty of power. Which is more likely, a p-value of 0.05 or a p-value of 0.0005?
Don, you have to embarrass yourself this time.
Don,
I think they're equally likely.
they are not.
2 for 2.
If the exposure does have an effect, then the p-value the distribution of p-values is heavily skewed to the right, such that lower p-values are more likely. So the idea of a p-value between 0.05 and 0.01 is less likely than a p-value of between 0.01 and 0.001. The lower p-values, the very, very low p-values, are more likely. And what that says is if you see a lot of p-values close to 0.05,
That's suspicious.
it's suspicious. It's not impossible, but it's suspicious. If there's truly an effect of the
shouldn't cluster
exposure,
there.
they shouldn't cluster around 0.05. They should cluster around 0.0005.
Unless
or
it's being driven by
0.001.
p-hacking and selective publication.
And
Which is
this
why
is-
some people are suggesting that we actually lower the p-value.
Yes.
Threshold. But that will just change the
not p-value.
threshold.
You don't lower the p-value,
Threshold.
you lower the alpha.
All right.
But I'm not a fan of either one of those things, as you know. But anyway.
You're
So
an
the idea
omega
is that,
man.
again, what's that?
You're an omega man.
I'm an
Omega man.
I don't know what that means.
But-
okay. So anyway, you get the idea. And so the response to this, to this and many other problems, is this idea of pre-registration. Chris, can you talk us through what this idea is?
Right. So the basic gist of it is that if you're a researcher and you do a study and the study comes out with a p-value of, say, 0.06, meaning not quite good enough to pass that magical bar of significance, you're going to find it more difficult to get your paper published. So this is one of the geneses of publication bias. And so to avoid that, researchers engage willfully or maybe subconsciously in various questionable research practices so that they can enhance the probability of getting that magic significant value on their result and therefore leading to publication and fame and fortune. And this has a corrosive effect on the medical literature over time and is generally deemed to be a bad thing.
Yep.
So to get around that, get around the fact that the journals are biased against not quite significant enough findings, what they're proposing is that you enter into sort of what is effectively a contract with a journal where you submit your background and method section with all your study objectives clearly stated, but without actually having done the experiment yet. So you do this at the beginning. Basically, you write to Journal X and you say, here is the experiment I'm going to do. It's been funded. We've got IRB approval, blah, 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 blah. These are the primary objectives. Do you think that this is a valuable experiment? And if you do, will you publish the results?
And the way we approach it is valid.
And the way we approach is valid, right? So it has to be a methodologically rigorous approach. But if we were to do this experiment as we have proposed, will you publish the results irrespective of whether we have a significant or a non-significant result, and that we're basically committing to publishing the results of the trial, full stop, and not play this game of whether it looks sexy based on p-values?
And I think you nailed it. I mean, I think the idea here is let's publish based on the
results.
science and the importance of the questions and not the results, and therefore that people will not have the incentive to manipulate their results. They'll give us the true results. They also will have specified exactly what their model, how they're going to model their data is ahead of time, so they can't change it. Now you are actually allowed to make changes, but then you have to specify all the ways you deviated.
Right.
And as long as you were able to do what you said you were going to do, they agreed to publish your paper. Don, do you think that this is something that we should be thinking about in the medical and epi literature?
Yeah, I do think it's something that we should be thinking about, whether we adopt it or not.
Wow. Right on the fence there.
Is another question.
Okay.
I think the problem exists,
Yeah,
and
question.
it really leads to this whole publication bias thing that we keep coming back to, and I think that is harmful. It's harmful in terms of knowing the truth, and I think it is really one of the main reasons why there's this crisis of irreproducibility that is sort of sweeping across the discipline, where there are shocking numbers of trials that are repeated of prior trials using the same conditions that where the previous trial showed a significant effect, and the repeat trial absolutely cannot do that.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a come to Jesus moment, I think, for the scientific community in terms of, are we really generating solid science? Are we generating facts that policy decisions can be based on, like an indication for an antidepressant in adolescents.
Right. Or what we're really doing is playing this game with the journals where we're creating this whole set of perverse incentives for poor scientific conduct.
Right.
QRPs, questionable research practices.
Yeah. And the other thing that I thought was really a smart idea about this is it allows for a upfront QC check about your methodology.
Quality control.
Quality control. You're going to submit essentially not your protocol, but the first two parts of your paper with all the methods in it, and it gives the reviewers a chance to give you feedback and say, I noticed X, Y, and Z. Did you consider doing this instead? Would you consider doing this instead?
Wasn't that already done when you submitted your grant to get funding for this?
Well, I would say to a degree, but the methodology in a grant can be a little bit vague in many cases, and for certain granting organizations like the NIH, you're not committed to using the methodology exactly that you specified in your grant. I mean, you should generally as a matter of good practice, but I think it's often the case that circumstances change.
Circumstances change, right?
And things can change. Whereas when you're actually launching the trial, that is really the final step where the protocol itself should be scrutinized. We have to say, here's the plan. We're going to execute the plan. Does everybody agree that this should be the plan and it's the best plan? And then you do that, and you come back and you find that it didn't work, and the journal is now committed to saying, despite having executed, faithfully executed this plan precisely, or to ask and answer this very important scientific question, we found that this thing does not work, and that is a useful result.
Yeah,
it didn't work.
Agreed, and we should be publishing more null findings. And I really like this idea of thinking about the science and the methods before we think about the result, and not publishing contingent based on the results. I struggle a little to understand whether we're talking here about trials, interventions, or whether we're talking about this would apply to observational studies as well, because with observational studies, often the data already exist,
right.
And I could write the registered report, let's say, after I've already done the analysis, let's say,
right.
And then pretend like I haven't. Now, obviously, we would trust people's scientific integrity, I assume, to deal with that problem. But it seems to me this makes more sense for trials than observational studies, but observational studies need some.
Or observational studies where there is primary data collection. Because you can have observational studies that can fit these criteria, whereas secondary data analysis, as you're referring to, is something that can potentially pose those problems where you can mix up the sequence of generating a hypothesis and doing the analysis.
I'm just thinking, like, practically speaking, if you were trying to do this for, say, like the Framingham Heart Study, where they've, published how many thousands of papers now?
Well, this is the criticism.
Every one of those would be
ineligible
and maybe unrealistic.
Well, so
but you might do some.
Maybe because I agree with you. I mean, I think that is the criticism that this gets, is that it would essentially be onerous. But if you're going to write that paper anyway, at some point you've got to write up the methods and the introduction, the justification of the question. So why not?
It's true.
Just do it ahead of time.
Why not do it? But the problem is that people, too often are, trolling their data sets.
I agree.
Looking at, doing chi-squares right and left, and then they say, oh, this one popped up. And suddenly you'll say, okay, is there any justification for this question? And it feels very like post hoc all of a sudden, like you've p-hacked your way into writing a new paper.
Yeah.
So
I agree. It's I think it doesn't fit quite well with observational studies. And last point, Don?
Maybe we need to think of it in a little bit of a different construct. I mean, there's this whole concept of exploratory analyses. So if you relegate that kind of an analysis that you just talked about, Chris, yep. Into that realm, you can say, okay, well, maybe this is a bona fide finding, but it's an exploratory analysis. So it needs to be replicated. So it's ripe for picking for replication. And then once it's replicated,
it's an interesting idea.
Then it becomes it becomes closer to a scientific truth.
Yeah, and then then we say, okay, now we're going to do the registered version of this, where a priori we say this is what we believe, we commit to it, and then we do the study. Sure, it seems open to manipulation, but everything. I mean, the current system is very manipulated, and therefore it seems interesting and worth thinking through.
Certainly for RCTs, this would be a great safeguard.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to our final segment. So we want to get into our amazing and amusing, where we highlight some of the things that go on in our field that just make us smile or give us a little bit more incentive to come to work each day. So, Don, you wanna take it first?
Sure. So I found a paper actually from it was noted in The Economist, in the March version of The Economist, which is one of my favorite places to pick up scientific findings.
Sure.
And they reported on a paper by Marco Luzza of Magna Graecia University in Italy. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Why should that get better treatment than everything else on this podcast?
That's right. At least it's not a medical term.
Like
atrial fibrillation.
Or angina.
angina.
So this study is based on the concept that there is a behavioral immune system.
Behavioral. Okay, so an immune system that goes out and protects your body.
Meaning that you behave in a certain way and people punch you in the playground?
Or no. You
Antibodies?
Hold on, guys. Hold on.
No, we want to guess.
What's it, charades?
20 questions.
How many words?
First syllable.
Bigger than a bread box?
So humans have evolved to notice and avoid sources of infection.
Infection.
Right. Whether it is rotten food or sickly individuals, i.e. through the...
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
the smell, the aversive or malodorous smells. So these authors hypothesized that there is a link between a person's sensitivity to malodorousness and the likelihood of them being sympathetic to, wait for it, right-wing authoritarian.
What?
Wait a minute.
So if
Go
they
back
smell...
now.
I'm serious.
So
if they
Wait, how do those go together?
I don't know. So so the behavioral plausibility of it is to be quite. Anyway,
Wait, what does that have to do with immune? Okay, go ahead. Go.
So the authors developed a body odor disgust scale called BODS, based on asking volunteers questions about different scenarios, such as noticing that a friend's feet smell. Which is a scale that correlates on it's a 1 to 5 scale.
Can we get the scale here in this room?
How strongly a person reacts to bad smells. So then they used the Amazon Mechanical Turk method, which is
What's that?
Which is an online way to do surveys where small tasks are given cash rewards.
Yeah.
So they amassed globally 201 volunteers, and they looked at the BOD scale. And whether it correlated with authoritarian views such as, quote, our country needs a powerful leader in order to destroy the radical and moral currents prevailing in society today.
Who would say that?
Right. So the results were that there were high BOD scores, i.e. they were smell sensitive. Correlated with authoritarian views. There was no correlation with high BOD scores and generally conservative views. So it was specific to authoritarian views. Then, because the study was done in 2016, during a very contentious election, they did it again, and they repeated it using 159 Americans. And they found a similar pattern. And in their analysis, they felt as if this explained about 4 to 16% of the variance associated between BODs and authoritarian views. And then they looked at voting intentions, and they increased the sample size again. They had 300. No, it's a whole other study.
Okay.
391 participants, Americans, and high BODs scores, i.e. smell aversion, correlated with voting for Trump, but not for Hillary.
Wow. And of course, Trump is a famous germaphobe.
I know.
So,
but I don't think this passes the sniff test.
Okay.
Didn't see that coming.
I'm going to say that I love that, despite the fact that I don't buy those results at all.
Really?
I love the study.
Correlation does not equal causation.
Love it, but don't buy the results at all. Can I just say something? So when I was just out of college, a friend of mine had her first job at Gillette. She was working as a microbiologist. Gillette makes deodorants.
Gillette the stadium all right.
Gillette the company down here in Boston, and they make deodorants and all that sort of stuff. And you could get extra money. You could get like overtime pay or whatever, extra money, to be a product tester. So you could test the deodorants. You could go and sit put on the deodorant and sit in the sweat chamber room or sauna or whatever it is and see how much you would sweat. Or and I believe you got paid more for this, you could volunteer to be the person
The
who
sniffer?
sniffed them and smelled how bad they smell. So it's a real thing. It's got real practical applications.
They had no authoritarians in that.
I don't know. I don't know. We could probably try and access the data and find out.
Did you get one of these jobs?
No, I did not.
That was a close shave.
Nick, cut that out. That's just way below his standard.
Chris, what do you got for
All right.
us?
So, I'm prone to long-winded stories.
What?
You have mentioned it on occasion.
So this is going to be more of the same?
It's going to be a short, long-winded story. But this was
Hold on. Let me assume a comfortable position here.
So you know how when we are looking at the relatedness of animals or bacteria or viruses, we do these genetic phylogenetic trees, which sort of show how different bacteria or cheetahs versus mountain lions are related in terms of their evolution of their DNA.
Yes.
And we create these branching things called phylogenies. So these guys did the same thing, except looking at the phylogeny of fairy tales in Europe.
Who are these guys?
This was a set of researchers. The original paper is the old. Where is it? It doesn't matter.
I think to them it does.
Because this was a dispatch. So this is like a summary of the other guy's paper, and I can't remember what the original paper was.
We'll get back to the
We'll
listener.
get back to that.
Somebody
it doesn't
did
much
something.
matter. Somebody
The point
did
is-
some analysis in a journal.
I hope someday my work is described that way.
They found a really interesting result. Let me tell you. But they did the same thing where they looked at vocabulary across the Indo-European languages as a way of sort of like changes in the words that were used or the way the words were spelled. In fairy tales across multiple different languages as a way of sort of like inferring the series of mutations in the words that occurred over the eons. And they actually
linguistic phylogeny.
Linguistic phylogeny, right? And they actually used the same kind of software analysis program that they used for doing genetic analysis. So it was, and they went and they found that there were 275 dominant fairy tales, and of those, they narrowed it down to a group of 76.
And it all goes back to one guy in the Bronx,
for which, who just spun some wild ones. They had 76 where they felt that they could, Bronx cheer. No, we're not talking.
Grimm.
I said it's Grimm.
Oh, Grimm, yeah. Grimm's fairy tales is part of this. Yes. Anyway, it turns out that some of the popular fairy tales, like Beauty and the Beast, go back to over 7,000 years.
Wow,
these are really old stories, and
isn't that before invented language?
No, we were grunting. Anyway, so it's kind of amazing. And the oldest tale of all is something called The Smith and the Devil, which we know as the French opera Faust. Where the guy sells his soul to the devil in turn to acquire skills in his trade and become successful. And that one probably goes back even longer to 8,000 years or older. It's a really old story.
So the first deal was a Faustian deal.
Yes, it was. There
Shocking.
Very cool.
Yeah, I thought it was a neat little study.
All right.
Published by some guys in some journal.
Oh, wow. I'm sure their parents would be very proud of them.
And secondarily cited by another guy whose name I forgot.
Okay, so for mine, I went straight down the middle this time to follow up on some of the things that we've been talking about for a while now, which is registered reports and, clinical trial registries and all those things. And I just wanted to highlight something that I saw that I'm really impressed by, which is that the BMJ, British Medical Journal, has started a new series. So this is written up in the BMJ by Ben Goldacre, Nicholas DeVito, Carl Hennigan's. Oh, I'm not even going to keep going because I'll get names wrong.
Some guys in some journal.
Sela Lane and Richard Stevens. And it's called, they say introduce the title of this article, but it's introducing the series, Introducing Unreported Clinical Trial of the Week.
Oh.
And so this is a series where they are going to go publish once a week. They're going to go into the clinical trial registry, presumably, find an important trial that should have had results by now and never published.
This is like public shaming.
And they're going to, see if this hopefully has a benefit in terms of getting people to publish the results or at least call people out for registering trials and then reporting the results back in.
So it's a wall of shame?
I think that's
It's
pretty much
not that they contact the authors and have them post their results or publish the results, just that shame.
They say, we hope this will make the rather abstract issue of publication bias more concrete, shed light on the problem, provide a forum to discuss challenges and misunderstandings around trial reporting, and ultimately improve reporting rates. Our initial sample of unreported trials will be drawn from those recently breaching the FDA Amendments Act of 2007, which requires clinical trials in the U.S. to be reported within 12 months of completion, and was initially hailed as proof the publication bias has now been addressed. And I didn't know this. Did you know that that you can be fined for not publishing your results in clinical trials? The fines of up to $10,000 per day for every overdue trial, but no such fine has ever been levied. But you can be fined massive amounts for not doing this, which I didn't even realize was a thing. So I thought this was pretty neat that they're going to do this, and I applaud them for taking that forward.
I agree. I think that what they ought to also do is they also ought to include studies where subsequent letters have pointed out significant flaws and the authors have not published a correction.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Are you going to start that series?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well done.
Dawn's Journal.
The Journal of Dawn. All right. Well, you made it to the end of the program. If you've got any feedback on this,
wasted another hour.
If you got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us.
Send Matt a pronunciation guide.
Or you want to send me a pronunciation guide, you can tweet us at @PopHealthyX, or you can tweet me at @ProfMattFox, or you can tweet Christopher
Gill
at id.gill, or Don at, you know what, just don't tweet Don. Or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org.
I would love if somebody would tweet me.
All your tweets go to the other Don.
Okay, so can I just say...
No,
so
I never get a direct tweet.
I'm sure I'm not the first person to have thought of this, but I would like a new system whereby you have to pay 5 cents for every tweet that you tweet.
Ooh.
But you can get a penny back for everyone who likes your tweet or retweets your tweet.
Cunning.
That would cut down on the number of tweets and the number of likes of tweets and retweets of tweets. And might limit it to things that were more important.
You got to get out more, Matt.
What if you had 10 friends who retweeted you and you just like give them a cut of the proceeds?
Would like to know, can I copyright a hashtag so that people have to pay me every time they use it? Anyway.
Sure can.
All right. So we'd like to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you download the next episode. We just hope you come back.
See you later.
Adios.